Association may fire 20,000 people for transportation workers, and they're going directly to Trump looking for assistance. So, so I think it's interesting what's going on, and we had also discussed the lawsuit against New York State by the restaurateurs. So I think that's really interesting. So we've got Jennifer Markowski talking, who's going to talk about the pandemic and protests, navigating work and return to work issues. I mean, just off the top of my head, if you return to work and you're caught in a riot, Jen, is there liability? I mean, why don't you kick off, tell us who you are, and then jump into this.
Sure, thank you very much, Marty. I appreciate you having me here today. I am a partner in Freeman Mathis and Gary's Boston office. I also practice in Rhode Island. And I'm the co-vice chair of our labor and employment group, which is a national group. So we see issues that come up all across the country, and these are issues that we've been talking about since at least back in March, in particular with the pandemic, but more recently with some of the issues that have come up with regard to protests. I think when we get to 2021 and we look back at 2020, those are probably two of the most defining words to describe the events and the things that have occurred in 2020, particularly when you're looking at it from an employment perspective. They present a whole host of different challenges and new issues for employers to deal with. And that's across the board, whether you're an employer that has 3 employees or you're a multinational organization. These issues really cut across from one organization to the other. And so want to give, this is a presentation that typically we talk for about an hour or so. I've sort of condensed it a little bit, and we're going to talk high level issues. And if we have time at the end, you can ask questions. If not, you can feel free to reach out and send me an email or pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that people might have. I want to talk first just a little bit about the protest side of it and some of the things that we are seeing in the employment context and the issues that employers are dealing with. And one thing that has come up, of course, are employers and employees are having a renewed focus on bringing in diversity and inclusion efforts. Either they have something that's in place, but they're more focused on it at the moment, and they're looking for ways to do that. Also, we're seeing issues with regard to protests, whether it's people being out of the office to attend protests, behavior that occurs at a protest, and does it impact the employee's status, disciplinary actions, things like that with their employer. And then also issues of just speech. Employees feel strongly on one issue or another, and they want to talk about things in the workplace, and where is the line between things that employees can talk about at the workplace versus things that an employer can say, we're not gonna talk about that here. So there are all sorts of interesting issues that come up with regard to that. And then of course the pandemic we've been now dealing with for quite some time. And there are a number of interesting, some novel issues that employers are having to face, and a whole complex set of federal laws, state laws, local ordinances that employers need to navigate and understand. But some of the most common questions that we see in our practice from our clients are questions about employees who are returning to work or maybe never left work, have been working throughout the pandemic and are testing positive for COVID-19, or perhaps they've been in close contact with someone who has. How do you deal with that? Testing and screening for COVID-19, employees that are coming back into the workplace, employers who want to make sure they have a safe workplace, they have a duty and an obligation to do that, and they're putting together guidelines to ensure that that happens. And sometimes questions about testing and screening and how can you properly do that comes up, as well as hiring practices. How do you hire individuals in the midst of the pandemic? And probably most importantly are the leave requests and accommodation requests that we get a lot of, whether it's because somebody is ill, caring for an ill family member, or has a child that is now remote learning and there are child care issues. So from just a sort of a big picture level, I think some of the three most important things to take away when approaching any one of these issues is to remember that these are really complicated issues. This is not a time to kind of have a knee-jerk reaction to an employee situation. So they're complicated, and employers need to consider and be compassionate with employee situations. Listen and treat each situation on a case-by-case basis, and then also come up with some creative and strategic thought processes about how to handle some of these difficult issues that are coming up in the workplace, and communicate effectively with employees. I hate to say this, that we hear this over and over again. These are, unprecedented times. It's very challenging. All of that is true. But you need to be understand that. And I think when we do look back, we will think, wow, that really was a fairly complicated and unusual time that we went through. So first, I want to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. And for organizations that either have a plan in place or are thinking about maybe spending some more time focusing on diversity and inclusion, lots of studies have been done that show that workplaces that are more diverse and have practices in place are more efficient and more profitable, and are basically work better. So there are a lot of positives and a lot of reasons why you want to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. And also, I've seen certainly clients who, when they're looking to do business with a partner, another organization, that's sometimes one of the first questions that they ask is, well, what are you doing for diversity and inclusion? What is your plan? How do you make sure that you have a diverse and workforce? So the first thing to do in looking at that issue is, of course, to come up with an organizational mission on that particular point. And it's something that you're going to include within your employee handbook and other places where you might not necessarily think of to talk about your organization's mission on that issue. You might want to include that in job descriptions. On your website is, of course, a great place to include that and remind both the employees and the public that that is an important part of your organization's mission. Also in common areas throughout your organization's workplace, for those of you that are back in the office, but just to make sure that it's out there, people are aware of it, and that they understand that this is a focus of the organization. And as a counter to that, to also have within your handbook strong anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, and anti-retaliation policies. They, of course, need to comply with on the federal level and the state level, and it will vary depending upon what state you're in, having the bare minimum, but doing more than just the bare minimum by reminding employees that those policies exist, by making sure that employees know that if they do have an issue or a complaint or concern, who they can go to, and also by reminding them that the organization has a policy of not retaliating against employees for raising concerns, that they are actually encouraged to bring forth those kinds of issues. So, after we've come up with our diversity and inclusion sort of mission statement and thought process on, where we're going with that, the next step is really to rethink hiring strategies, because that is how organizations grow a diverse workforce, is really through hiring. And the first step, I think, in that process is to understand that we all have biases, and those biases creep into our thought-making, decision-making process. And there are confirmation biases, conformity biases, all sorts of studies have been done on how people's subconscious biases will affect their decision-making process. So there are ways that you can try to eliminate that if you or whoever in your organization is involved in the hiring process, to try to eliminate those biases and to really focus more on the applicant without having any of the other information available that might impact their decision making. And so there are available opportunities for blind screening of applicants. And that would involve taking out of the application any information that would maybe give you some insight as to their background, their national origin, age, gender, things like that. So you really are truly just blindly screening an applicant based upon their history and their experience, their work, their relevant experience. Also having job descriptions that are more results-based versus qualification-based. There's evidence that that brings in a more diverse workforce. And trying to steer clear of the sort of gut reaction or gut decision-making process in the hiring process. We've all had situations where you feel like, oh, I just hit it off with that person. We connected immediately. I liked that person. I thought they would be a good fit. And that may very well be, and that's great, but that shouldn't be the driving force or factor in making a decision as to whether or not to hire person A over person B. And in addition to thinking about who you're bringing into the organization, implementing training across the organization is very important. And I don't mean training where you sit down at a computer and you watch a video for an hour. It's really important to have training that is actually engaging employees. Make it whether you do it on a yearly basis or every other year, include employees in it, make it interactive, not just a sort of check the box type training, but make it a part of the overall culture of the organization, that this is important to us to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. And as a result of that, we're going to do training and everyone's going to participate in it. And then I would also say specifically breaking out any supervisors or managers and having on that level a separate training, because there are additional, obviously supervisors and managers have impact on the overall organization in a different way. So it's important to have it at that level as well. And then lastly, I would also suggest having intra-group networks within the organization where employees can turn to one another for support and discussion, and whatever else, connection amongst the workforce. When people are supported and feel like they're being heard and listened to, they tend to have greater morale and less turnover. And those, of course, are all good things for an organization. Less turnover means less loss associated with rehiring and retraining and those kinds of things. And it just has a general overall positive impact on the morale within the workforce. So that's something to just keep in mind as part of your overall diversity and inclusion process when you're thinking about that. So after we've sort of come up with our mission and our goal, that we're going to have this diverse and inclusive work environment, one of the things that comes up in the course of that, our employees are wanting to do their part. And so we get a lot of questions from employers about employees that are off, say, wanting to go to a protest, right? So you got to have an employee who says, well, I'm not coming in today. There's this, a rally that's downtown, and it's important to me. I want to go to it. I want to support this particular event. And you as an employer have to allow that employee to go to that event. There isn't anything on a federal level that in any way protects things that would be maybe considered of a political nature, that would require an employer to say, yes, you can absolutely go to that. It really comes back to what the employer's policy is internally. And the policy will be guided by local and state laws. And there are, in fact, some states that do have some protections for political activities. So you certainly want to consult as you're looking at developing a policy on this particular topic. You want to consult with an attorney and know what your local laws require with regard to that. But on a broader level, you want to have a policy in place and let that employee know that, well, we have a leave policy or we have a PTO policy, and here's what it is. You, unless it's an emergency, cannot call the day of and let us know. You have to follow this process. So, next time you want to take leave or PTO to go do whatever it might be, whether it's attending a political rally or just taking some me time off, this is the process that you follow, and you're more than welcome to do that, because you want to avoid the situation where you have employees that are saying, well, so-and-so got to take a last minute day off to go do activity A. I wanted to go to this protest and you declined my request. You want to have even-handed treatment, so there isn't some sort of a risk of an employee saying similarly situated employers are being treated differently.
Hey, Jen, I want to just jump in here for 2 seconds.
Sure.
So where are the resources to, figure all this out? Do you go to a human resource benefit consulting firm? How do you work this all in? Are there frameworks that are readily available? There's like industry-wide practices, best practices. I mean, what are the resources that are available?
Sure. Certainly law firms, lawyers, labor and employment counselors can work to put together policies and make sure that whatever policy you come up with is compliant with the state in which the company is operating. And so if you have a national company, you're going to maybe have different policies in different states, or you're going to have one that covers at least the most conservative, states that you operate in, and maybe make that the standard across the board. But you can consult with attorneys on that particular issue. You can reach out there are, human resources consulting companies as well. But most states do, there are certain things that are required to be put into a written policy and provided to employees as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's going to be a sea change in best practices. The protests have obviously made, people consider how they act.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why there's a lot of focus right now internally in organizations about, well, what can we do to just make our workplace be a respectful workplace and also make, be more diverse. So certainly a topic on everybody's mind. So just to give, also another sort of example of how this might come up, a lot of people when you see this in the news, where you have employees that are showing up to work and they're wearing essentially, political statement, whether it's, for example, somebody that shows up to work and has a mask that says Black Lives Matter, and then say the next day somebody else shows up and they're wearing a mask and it says Blue Lives Matter. And there's some of the folks are feeling uncomfortable by that. They feel like that's, it's racist, it's not appropriate. They find it to be offensive, and they raise an issue and there's a complaint about it. How do you avoid that situation from coming up? Because people are certainly feeling empowered and wanting to talk about these issues. And sometimes it's appropriate to talk about it in the workplace and sometimes it's not. But one thing you can do is have in place a policy, a strict dress code policy, that perhaps no political statements of any kind can be worn on clothing. The trick is always making sure that it is uniformly applied. You don't want to have a situation where someone says, well, that point of view you allow someone to express, but my point of view you're saying no to. So again, uniformity and having a policy.
You see how it might get a little bit squirrely if you are a far-flung company, but some of your offices are in WeWorks where there's people with different policies in place, right?
Correct.
So, yeah.
Yes, certainly there are lots of hot topics out there and a lot of strongly held beliefs that you can see these kinds of controversies coming up, and the same is true on social media. And social media, of course, presents a whole different set of issues because now it's not even just in the workplace. People maybe they're doing something on their own time, but they're connecting it back to what's happening at work. So one of the things that employers do want to be mindful of is that if you're a private employer, the National Labor Relations Act does allow employees to engage in what's called concerted activity. So they can sort of talk about issues that relate to working conditions and express their opinions and their views on it. And employers can't prohibit them or retaliate against them for having done that. So you want to be mindful of that, but employers can also develop social media policies that restrict certain things, employees from doing certain things. Like you can say you're not to do it on work time, you're not just to make representations that you're speaking on behalf of the company, you're not to disclose confidential information, you're not to disparage the company. Of course, carving out, sort of that the NLRA, like you're not prohibiting them from talking about working conditions. You let them know that violation of the policy, there's some potential for disciplinary action. And of course, making sure that employees know that what they post on social media should not violate the company's EEO policy, anti-harassment policy, or anti-retaliation policy. So that's another way. Again, uniformity is important. If you're going to have the policy, it's only as good as if you're actually using it. You have to actually implement the policy and apply it across the board. Occasionally we do run into issues where employers have, somebody's been off on their own time, perhaps at a protest, engaging in what would be considered, I'll generically refer to as bad behavior. violating the law. Let's say one person is out, they violated, curfew, and somebody else has physically assaulted somebody else at this protest that they're attending. And that kind of spills back over into the workplace. And as an employer, how do you deal with that? Do you discipline those employees or not? And it's really very fact specific. And obviously you can see that there might be something that you might deem to be completely unacceptable. Somebody assaults somebody else, maybe it's a supervisor, and you're concerned about, what is that, would that person present a danger at the workplace if this is how they reacted? In this particular scenario, very fact specific, but of course, if a situation like that comes up, the first thing to do is to investigate, and then you decide, does this out of work activity warrant some kind of discipline here at the office?
Right. And you bring up a great point there, which is, when these kind of worlds collide of people who, may have personal crises in the office, what's the way to handle that stuff? I think it's real important.
And I think, a lot of people, I see it in my practice with attorneys even, and in cases where, temperatures can run very hot, people are on edge, a lot of different things that are going on that are causing people to be very stressed out. So I think having that, taking a step back and really thinking about the process, which brings me back to my initial, don't have a knee-jerk reaction or knee-jerk decision to some of these issues as they come up. You really need to think about it and give some time to digest and figure out exactly what it is that has happened before making those decisions.
Right. I'm of the opinion that all discourse unrelated to business of the business is unuseful. So, and then of course, if your business is retail or social, then you're going to have to discuss it, but and come out with policies and procedures. However, I think it's better to take a conservative tact.
Right. In a lot of
so robust before you start stepping on toes.
Right. And you can restrict in a lot of instances certain kinds of speech. I mean, it's not, with private employers, it's not a free speech issue. Really, the one countervailing factor is it something that's protected? Is it speech that's protected under the NLRA? But beyond that, you do have some ability to take that kind of an approach that, like, we're here to talk about work, and let's talk about that. So I do want to talk, I know we've just got a few more minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about COVID and how it has impacted employers, and particularly with the return to work. I know a lot of, obviously, employers have been remote. Number of different statutes. We could spend hours talking about, the different acts that have been, that both previously were already in place, and then you got the CARES Act, that Families First Coronavirus Act. They affect leave issues, accommodation issues, discrimination issues, all sorts of things. So just, again, treading carefully if you are running into a situation where there is, it's related in some way to COVID-19. Couple of big picture points, because I think most employers that are bringing people back to work may run into a situation where you've got an employee that has been diagnosed with COVID, come in contact with someone that's, been in close contact. You want to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, but the general rule of thumb is if they've been, they've exhibited symptoms or they have been tested positive, that individual needs to quarantine, stay away from the workplace for at least 14 days, and or not return until their employer has cleared them, their physician has cleared them to return to work. And if you do run into that situation and that employee has been in the workplace, you want to figure out who has that employee come in close contact with. Doesn't necessarily mean everyone in the workplace, but if there's a group that they have worked with and in close contact with, discussed things with, that you're concerned about, then those employees should be notified. But most importantly, you can't disclose who the employee is that has been diagnosed with COVID. The identity stays confidential, but you can share that information, and should, and let employees know, hey, you might need to self-quarantine as well. You might need to go back and talk to your physician as well.
Jen, is this policy like a one-size-fits-all policy? Or is it a policy that may vary by age? Like, I've heard of companies are saying, like, come into the office, but however, if you are in one of the risk groups, do not come into the office.
Yeah, so it's really will be on a case by case basis, meaning, what is the industry like? What is the work setup like? What functions can be performed remotely or not? And you have situations where people work in very close quarters. It's in a shared space, say you don't have separate offices. So you really have to look at what the setup is, and I recommend coming up with a written policy and a written guideline that says, here's what our expectations are. Here's what we're requiring, everything down to whether it's wearing masks, having hand sanitizer, social distancing, lots and lots of details that go into that, making sure all of the employees have a copy of what you come up with for the guidelines, which should track basically the CDC guidelines largely, any local health organizations, and employees should get that. They should have it. They should also feel comfortable to let the employer know if they feel like there's been a violation, that somebody's not following those protocols. But it should absolutely be written and distributed to everybody at the office.
Great. Andrew, are you available right now? Andrew Brown, TriNet. Fantastic.
I'm already, yes, I am.
So we're lucky that we have TriNet on as well. And I was wondering, Andrew, if you have any commentary that might be additional to what Jenna said. You guys are the leading outsourced human resource and human benefits consulting firm and service firm in the world, right? So do you have any comments on policy?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things going on, a lot of things changing. And, I agree with a lot of Jennifer's comments. I mean, I think employers need to be flexible, and they really need to kind of look at all aspects before they make decisions. And policy is just, you really have to take your time with it and take each situation case by case.
Yep. So Jen, do you have any closing comments?
I would say, I guess I would sort of echo a little bit of what Andrew just said is, these are challenging times, and being thoughtful and compassionate about these decisions. As much as, I always counsel you want to have policies, you want employees to have some guidelines and some understanding of what the expectations are, what they can and can't do. It is also very important to just remember that people are going through difficult situations, some of which we might know about or not know about, and to take that into consideration, because we really just don't know a year from now how all of this is going to shake out, or 2 years from now. So it's important to just be compassionate and understand and consider each situation on its own.
Well, Jen, thanks so much. Very informative. Again,